Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have more people on their way in, but we have a video to watch from our namesake, Charley Steiner, so I don't want to rob our 9 a.m. panel of too much of their time. So as we get going, before we start the video, there's just a few acknowledgments I would like to make. When you plan an event like this, it takes a very long time, and I've had a lot of help. And there's just some people that I wanted to acknowledge before we get going here. For starters, the Steiner Planning Committee, which consisted of Professor Chris Marsh, Dr. Dakota Horn, Dr. Katie Biddle, and student worker Peyton Coburn. That has been super helpful. To our department chair, Dr. Tony Adams, for his support. Our dean, Ethan Ham, for his support. All of the technical support, we could not have done it without them. Jamie Glenzinski, who's our department administrator, has done so much. She was here at like 7 a.m. this morning, setting up here at 3 p.m. Yesterday in this room, setting up. Corinne Schneiderman, another student worker who's done great work for us, helping. Paige Dean, who designed the poster and the programs for this event. Our technical staff, Dave Linney, Avishi Pant, Abby Westman. I have that written down. I'm losing it. Abby Westman, Caden Sexton, and Liz Siddons. We appreciate your help. Kim Tallick, another administrative support. To Sarah Ehrlichman, Dr. Sarah Ehrlichman, and Ad Influence for the posters and the work that they helped put together. The Greg and Dan Show, WMBD Radio, for being a great supporter of our program. Jason Mott and the Peoria Chiefs for helping put on a great event last night. I would also like to acknowledge our provost, Dr. Dan Moon, has joined us this morning. Thank you, Dr. Moon. One of the creators of this program, a guy who's getting to live the high life now, Dr. Paul Gollifer, has joined us. Appreciate that. To Delaney Giles and the BU influencers and all others who had a hand in making this the event that it is. I also want to acknowledge, as we're about to start this video, that you're going to see a stream of high school students come in here very soon. Don't worry about that. They're just going to take a seat. But Charley Steiner has meant a lot to this program. Charley Steiner is a 1971 Bradley graduate, for those who do not know, and has had a distinguished career. He, of course, wishes he could have been here in person, but he did shoot a video that we're going to watch right now.
Thank you, Josh, and welcome everybody to the Steiner Symposium. I still can't get over the fact that my name is attached to all of that, because when I was a student at Bradley 50-something years ago, they couldn't get rid of me fast enough. And now, of course, I'm so proud to be still at the university with my name attached to the school and the profession that I've worked at for almost 60 years now. So this is the ninth symposium. The first was back in 2015. The late Larry King, a dear friend of mine, and I kind of opened the show for business. Larry and I would have a lengthy discussion, and then we went into some of the programs that we would discuss. Trending in sports communication. Where were we headed? We didn't know. But two guys who became enormously popular and successful in our business, Jared Stacy and Scott Ackerson. Jared is now in charge of Amazon Sports and all the things they do around the world. And Scott Ackerson led the way in the beginning for Fox on their Fox Sports Sundays program. And we talked about building a brand. Where do you go? How do you start? And the great Josh Dickhouse was part of that panel. Josh, of course, has had such an important impact on this symposium, and he's been there from the beginning. I'm glad I'm with him, and he is with me. We talked about reporting issues and challenges. How do you deal with those who don't want to deal with you. And we talked about women in sports, their role. And some of the people we've had over the years included, well, Jane Levy, best-selling author, Jeff Passan, who is the baseball head writer at ESPN, Molly Knight, best-selling author, Dave Kindred. So there were a lot of folks then. But now the topics are different. Times have changed. For instance, we have 4 major topics we're going to talk about today. The impact of streaming services on sports. Streaming. What was streaming 11 years ago? It was nothing. It hadn't been thought of yet. And now it is so important in our industry for you to work in, and how it is just changing the dynamic. We're watching more stuff at home than we are at the theaters. And again, we're going to talk about building a sports brand. That's one similarity that we have from 11 years ago. And NIL. NIL were 3 letters 11 years ago, and how that's transformed college sports, where some players, when they turn pro, may actually take a pay cut. And we're going to talk about the effects of analytics in sports. That was nothing then. We just kind of guessed, hey, he can hit a right-hander, he can't hit a left-hander. But now, of course, analytics has changed nearly everything, up to and including balls and strikes in Major League Baseball. Who would have ever thought that? And the other thing I'm especially proud of, the number of people who have come in to take part in this symposium from all across the country. University of Alabama, Wisconsin, Penn State, University of Illinois at Indianapolis, headed up by my friend Malcolm Moran. Malcolm and I were young reporters together 40-something years ago in New York, and he's made a great mark on sports communication. And we're going to talk about the analytics, including folks from Northwestern and the University of Oregon. So we have a wide-ranging number of topics, wide-ranging number of people who are going to talk about it. I urge you to listen, because looking to the future, again, 11 years ago, what was streaming? What was NIL? What's it going to look like 10 or 11 years from now? Maybe today we'll get the first clue of where we're going. So thank you again for being here. I want to thank Josh again for all he has done in putting this together. Sit back and learn as much as you can. Have a great day.
So that means then, without further ado, we are going to kick things off here with our Impact of Streaming Services panel. Allow me to introduce that panel moderator, Dr. Dakota Horn, Associate Dean of the Slane College of Communication and Fine Arts.
Thank you, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have the honor of introducing and then guiding a conversation with 2 of the giants in terms of understanding streaming, sports, that intersection. It's going to be a lot of fun. So first, I'd like to introduce my dear friend, Corey Barker. He is an assistant teaching professor at the Belisario College of Communication at Penn State. Corey's research focuses on the media industry, convergences, particularly legacy media institutions' use of new technology in production, promotion, and distribution strategies. His book, Social TV, Multi-Screen Content and Ephemeral Culture, reveals how the U.S. television industry promised, yet failed to deliver a social media revolution in the 2010s. The book was honored with the Outstanding Book Award from the Media Industries Studies Interest Group at the 2023 Society for Cinema and Media Studies Annual Conference. Corey's work has been published in Comedy Studies, Television and New Media, New Review of Film and Television Studies, Women's Studies in Communication, Participations, Journal of Audience and Reception Studies, and From Networks to Netflix, A Guide to Changing Channels. And most importantly, prior to Penn State, he was a tenured faculty member in the greatest department of communication in the world here at Bradley University. Help me in welcoming Dr. Corey Barker. We have Dr. Andy Billings, serves as the co-director of the Beyond Sports Initiative, the Ronald Reagan Chair of Broadcasting, and the Associate Dean for Faculty in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama. Having authored 27 books and over 290 journal articles and book chapters, he is the most published sports media scholar in the world. His work has been cited over 12,000 times, largely focusing on issues triangulating sport, media, and issues of identity. He is the editor-in-chief for the most prominent academic journal, Communication in Sport, and has been interviewed over 700 times by news outlets including the New York Times, Associated Press, and ESPN. Billings has studied sports media phenomena for 20 nations, earning over 60 awards from the International Communication Association, National Communication Association, Broadcast Education Association, and Association for Education and Journalism and Mass Communication. He is a fellow of the International Communication Association and North American Society for Sociology of Sport. He is also a former visiting chair of Olympism at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and a past research symposium chair for the Broadcast Education Association. In 2025, he was given the Lifetime Achievement and Scholarship Award by the Broadcast Education Association. Help me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Billings. Okay, their bio is pretty impressive. Let's see how they can handle some questions. This is going to be a lot of fun, folks. This is a huge conversation in our classrooms and across the world, streaming, sports, and that intersection. So I'm going to throw it to the two of you simultaneously. Streaming era. Has this made sports better? Worse? What's going on here? What's your gut reaction to the most vague question that I could possibly give you? What do you got?
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
No, I think you have to answer this in a couple ways. So in terms of the number of things out there that you can access, it's incredibly diverse, and we have possibilities that we did not have even just a few years ago. My youngest son is a freshman at Indiana University, and yet he can access his high school soccer team playing in Alabama and watch that in a way that was not possible previously before the streaming era. But there have been some severe limitations that have come specifically in sports media as it relates to access, latency, things like that. So, I know we'll get into a lot of those things, but basically one of the big appeals of streaming is you can watch what you want when you want to. But one of the big appeals of sports is you have to watch it now. So a lot of those things, a lot of those appeals of, sure, I could watch last night's game this morning, but do you want to? No. We've gotten better with this. But for instance, even a lot of our streams, if you watch something on YouTube TV, you still have about a 30-second delay between what happens in the stadium or in the arena from what you see at home. In the 1980s, that was 4 seconds. So it's gotten substantially worse in that regard. The cost of streaming services also has made it very difficult to navigate. For this upcoming season, if you actually wanted to access every single NFL game, both in market, out of market, things like that, it's at least $900 worth of streaming services that you need to have access to. And then once again, finding the game is often very difficult, where you aren't quite sure, okay, this Big Ten contract is owned by these three companies, and so which one actually has the game? And also, and we'll get into this, but the toggling between different streaming services is not nearly as frictionless as the flashback or last channel button that you used to have decades ago. So there's a lot of things working against sports media that for just about any other genre really are pluses in the streaming space. So I'll stop there, see what Dr. Parker has to say. But in general, you've got this wide spectrum, which is terrific. but there's so much friction now that goes into accessing that wide spectrum.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think if you are interested or become interested in more niche sports, right, you have an access point to them in a way that you simply did not 5, 10, 25 years ago. That if you're into a particular, European soccer league or a particular style of auto racing, the ability to go and find that, especially if you're willing to pay for it, is so much easier than it was before. And I also think it's easier to find, clips and segments, and I think we'll talk a lot about the additional content that surrounds the game, right? You can find so much of that and learn about what has happened and what the primary issues are in a given season or a given week, even more than you could before, and you can personalize that to a really immense degree. But there are, as Dr. Billings mentioned, so many limitations, especially for folks who do not or cannot pay for access to all of the different platforms, no matter what sports they enjoy. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of the specific examples of that, but more, games that used to be on conventional broadcast television that technically you can get for free, being imported to different streaming services, whether that's a regular season game or a playoff game, and the way that has created flashpoint conflicts, I think, between consumers and the sports leagues and the companies that they're in, concert with, trying to build out the streaming ecosystem. It's made a lot of people a lot of money. It's made it in many ways more expensive for us to access those things. But if you really love something, you can get it faster. You can get more access to it than you could before. But the overall environment is obviously quite complex to the point that I don't know if I would say it's been a net good.
Okay. I'm interested first in kind of this definition of wraparound coverage, right? And also the content sports leagues and their broadcast partners are producing to support their streaming expansions, like more studio shows, alternate broadcasts, podcasts being thrown in. So first of all, can we kind of define for our audience, make sure we understand what wraparound coverage is, and then what's going on, all the options that we have, what does it look like, and stuff like that. Dr. Barker, we'll probably start with you on that.
Yeah, this is something I'm really interested in. A lot of my work is kind of focused on what we would call paratextual content, right? Things that we don't think of as like the main thing. So in sports, we often think of the main thing, of course, as the games. So all of the additional stuff that surrounds that, streaming is obviously a great place for the expansion of that types of media, right? Whether that is increased studio coverage, which obviously, ESPN and its series of channels have been operating in a 24-hour schedule for decades. So they've obviously produced a lot of additional non-game content for ages. But streaming platforms have incentivized companies to explore things like alternate broadcasts, right? So if you're watching the national championship college basketball game, the men's game the other day, CBS and Paramount Plus had a alternate broadcast where all 5 original members of the Fab Five, the Michigan men's basketball team from the early 90s, were watching and commenting on the game together. A lot of the different sports broadcasters and streamers have explored those types of alternate broadcasts, either with current coaches, former coaches, celebrities, comedians, right? So there's an effort to use streaming to try to pull different audiences into the live broadcast, right? Who might not be as interested in watching the conventional presentation of the game. We've seen this expand with the various, Nickelodeon football games and the Disney Plus or related Disney channel programming that's been animated, right? So that just this past week, they did an Inside Out hockey game, right? And trying to pull in even younger people to the streaming environment to get them into the game and hopefully, turn them into long-term fans of the sport, but also long-term subscribers to those streaming services. And so I think we're at a period where there's a lot of experiments to try to figure out, we've got people paying for these things. How do we either keep those people subscribing, or how do we pull in new people or different members within that family that share a subscription to incentivize, back to something that Andrew mentioned, the live experience, right? Like how do we get people to continue to watch these games live when they have an unreasonable number of options that they can see highlights on social media or YouTube very quickly after something happens? So maybe there's less incentive to watch live. So I feel like a lot of this additional wraparound bonus media is clearly an effort on the part of leagues and their broadcast partners, streaming partners, to figure out how do we get people to keep watching live? Because sports is still something that people do watch live, but in a lot of cases, less than people did, 5, 10, and beyond years ago. So it's a really fascinating place for experimentation. But on the sort of analyst side or even the viewer side, we rarely know how successful these things are, right? Because they're on streaming services and the companies don't always reveal any information about how many people tuned into the Toy Story version of Monday Night Football versus the regular broadcast. And if they do, that just gets fed into an overall larger number that so many million viewers watch it across all 12 of our platforms, right? So that doesn't actually tell us much about how successful is this alternate broadcast or these wraparound shows. So it's a really fascinating experimental period that we're seeing right now in this regard.
Yeah. This is certainly Dr. Barker's wheelhouse, but I will note a couple things here. I think we kind of, we initially thought or heard arguments that as we got more television channels and then as we moved into streaming era, that what would happen would be we get this breadth of sports and sports coverage. This could help promote women's sports. This could do a lot of different things there. And certainly you can find those, but what has happened on the mainstream offerings is this wraparound coverage instead. So if you look at, and I believe it, we'll have another report here at the end of the year from Cheryl Cookie and her colleagues looking at the different types of local and national coverage. Increasingly, the mainstream ESPN or Fox One or whatever it is, they're almost exclusively focusing on just a couple sports. So instead of getting more women's soccer, what you got was more NFL draft coverage, or you get a lot more of talking heads debating issues in men's basketball and football and in baseball. You didn't get that democratization that I think was promised to some degree. Really then, when we talk about, we don't even know the ratings on a lot of these streaming services. For scripted dramas, they don't care that much about, it's great that Stranger Things gets watched a lot and that justified their huge budget or whatever it is, but it's much more of what I used to call the HBO model from 20 years ago, where they just want your subscription dollars. It doesn't really matter if you watch a whole bunch of their programming. You just have to have one thing that you can't live without. So with HBO, it might have, 20 years ago, it might have been The Sopranos. 10 years ago, it might have been Game of Thrones. It's great if you watched more of their programming, but even if you didn't, they still got the same amount of money from you from that subscription. Sports function differently in one regard. Certainly that subscription thing matters, but it's about the only thing. An NFL game on Netflix, it's about the only thing that even if you pay for ad-free, you're getting ads and no one complains. So you have this extra revenue source and you do care how many people tuned in because that helps you set your ad rates. So once again, you've got all these other genres and then you've got sports, and sports are functioning differently even in that regard. Last thing I'll say too with the wraparound coverage is a lot of what are being offered is free or next to free. So we can promise a lot of different alt casts and things like that. It hardly costs. It costs ESPN nothing to take their pylon cam from the College Football National Championship and say we're showing. You can watch the title game in 18 different ways, and one is just looking at the pylon, and people will, for some reason, they'll be streaming, I think they get 20 or 30,000 people who are streaming it at any given point. But a lot of these things are simply to be able to say. They're offering a lot of different customizable ways without really affecting their bottom line much.
And just to build on one thing that Andrew said there about maybe the lack of actual coverage on a wider range of sports, that the way that impacts folks doing this job, that, one of the bigger stories in the last few years is obviously ESPN buying the NFL network, right, which used to be its own entity, both as a cable channel and as a whole media production unit. And now that's being folded into the larger ESPN infrastructure. And what that means, even for the most popular sports league in our country, is that there are people who are losing their jobs or being downsized, and even they are trying to think about ways that, well, we don't actually need kind of 2 channels worth of this additional wraparound bonus content for the sport and the sports media category that people in this country seem to not be able to get enough of, right? Even in that regard, there's a sense of, well, we don't need this much, right? So I think that's not only do you see maybe a lack of diversity despite all of the unlimited options we have, but that even extends to what's happening in the major sports. Similar things happened, with TNT Sports and Turner getting out of not renewing their contract with the NBA, which had existed for 30 some years, and all of the folks who either lost their job or kind of had to move over to something else as a result of, we're spending all of our money elsewhere in streaming, so maybe we can't continue to spend the money here in sports. And so some of these things that have been institutions on cable TV, right, are now fizzling out or being modified in a way that underlines that despite all of the hype and the discourse, like streaming doesn't give us everything that we want all the time, for one reasonable price.
Thanks, guys. I'm going to have a question for Dr. Billings here in just a second. But for my audience members, in about 2 questions, I'm turning it over to all of you to ask these panelists questions. So please start making note of what you're going to ask them. There's something on the line, too.
Sure.
These 2 individuals have brought some stuff to give away. Those of you that asked the best question, each one of them is going to give you something. What'd we bring today? Oh, we got them right here?
Yeah, I've got
Swag
bags of
bags.
stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So be thinking of the best question that you can ask. In about 2 questions, I'm turning it over to you. Dr. Billings, a few years ago, you published a book, The Rise and Fall of Mass Communication. Can you explain the premise?
Sure.
And then how does it fit into our streaming conversation today? And then Dr. Barker, after he's through, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, it was a book I co-authored with a giant in the field, Dr. Bill Benoit, who really does especially a lot of work in news and politics and things like that. And we were having this discussion. It was largely over the same thing, which is the lack of water cooler moments anymore. They were called water cooler moments because you would all watch it at the same time and then discuss it over the water cooler the next day. And we really felt like there were very few things that people were consuming at the same time to actually have a conversation. And so we built this notion of the rise and fall of mass communication. Not to say that it's terrible now, but it's focused on that word mass. It's focused on that notion of, all right, can we have broadcasting without broad receiving? So yes, I can broadcast all of my thoughts on social media right now. But the average number of people who reads a social media post is 4. So yeah, LeBron James can post today and he'll get millions of people to read that. But for most people, yeah, yours is broadly cast, but it's not broadly received. And so we really tried to get into that notion of have we fragmented things out to the point that we're not consuming things in the same way at the same time anymore. And really what it comes down to for sports and streaming is you could, for instance, look at college football ratings other than the playoff and say, these are down. These are down from decades ago. Interest in college football is not down. What has happened is, when I was growing up, in the 80s when I was old, or before I was old, there would just be 3 college football games on a given Saturday that were broadcast to the world. They could get huge numbers because there weren't alternatives. Well, now, if you're a college football fan, there might be, just on mainstream channels and core streaming services, you might have 8 games competing against each other. The aggregate still gets you a number, but you don't have that coalescing around one thing. A lot of what we even talked about before, customizable and things like that. How many things do we really watch at the same time in the same way? Maybe you watched the football game, but now someone watched the altcast, so they saw something different. Or you watched Peyton and Eli on Monday Night Football, and so you watched it, but it was a different set of banter. We started to look at things like political debates. Like, oh, well, everyone would watch a presidential debate at the same time in the same way. Well, it's shown on 15 different channels and networks. Some do a side-by-side shot, some do a full screen, some have fact checks, some don't. There's very few things that we're consuming in the same way at the same time. So one aspect of the streaming era that we have to discuss is that notion that very few things that you're consuming are being consumed in remotely the same way, even the device that we use. ESPN still uses the concept of optimal available screen. And it's still like 94% say, of all the screen options, I prefer TV, like a big television. But that's not remotely 94% of the consumption, because we're on the go and we're watching on our phones and our iPads and our laptops, and all that is great. But watching on my phone here is different than sitting at home. And we haven't necessarily accounted for some of those differences that we have in what really constitutes the sports media viewing experience.
Anything you want to add, or can I?
I think we can move on.
Okay.
Yeah, I see.
I got 2 more questions before we start turning it over to our audience. And Dr. Barker, this is probably more for you. So streamers are buying up these sports live rights licenses, right? Mm-hmm. And it's one of the big drivers that are causing subscription prices to go up. So you would assume that's generally worse for the fan or the consumer. How does that interplay? We want more stuff, but we don't want more prices. Like, walk us through what's happening and how it affects us as a streamer.
Yeah, I think that's one of the predominant stories in every league in thinking about the balance between, revenue and how that impacts things like salary cap and what players are being paid and the various machinations related to how transactions can play out. But then the way that obviously affects the consumer experience, I think, is a really big talking point. I think this year, or between 25 and 26, over $15 billion being spent on the licenses between all the different streaming platforms for sports. And again, there are historical parallels to that. Like, those licenses have been getting larger and larger and larger across broadcast to cable and now to streaming. But certainly it makes things more complicated for us as consumers, right? That to Andrew's point earlier about how much money you need to watch, all of the NFL games. The NBA has had a similar unbundling from just a few broadcast partners to now being across a number of streaming platforms, broadcast TV, still some on cable, including, they've got their return to a relationship with NBC, who they worked with for a really long time, especially during the 90s. It's nostalgia for a lot of people. But the relationship with NBC Sports includes some games on NBC, some games on NBC Sports, their revived cable channel, and a lot of games on Peacock. And even at the beginning of the season, there was confusion among fans about what games were going to be where. And even in some night, they say they have a double header, and one of the games is on Peacock and one of the games is on NBC, and that combination can be confusing, to Andrew's point about even being able to switch between those things. And it seems to me depending on how well your sport is or your league is perceived, the more you're able to navigate through this, right? The NFL has been slowly and then more quickly unbundling individual games, right? Is if you watch NFL football, right, in the last few years, the increase in the number of individual games that have been given to various partners that have maybe a broadcast network that now have a streamer, right? Notably, doing a playoff game on Peacock, right? Or now doing some of the games on Christmas Day on Netflix, right? And the way in which a playoff game on Amazon Prime, right? And sort of doing it slowly like that. Each time there's all this news coverage about how the fans hate that, people are complaining, various bars that usually show these games are having trouble with that because the streaming complications are maybe there in the way that the broadcast license for a public space operates in a different way. But the NFL is so popular that those are isolated incidents, right? Whereas something like the NBA, which is popular but has a lot of broader conversations about the future of the game, the future of the league, things like tanking, the sort of foul baiting, all of these things that have kind of a negative framing for the NBA. Then when people are complaining about all of the different streaming unbundlings, that just gets fed into this narrative that the NBA under Adam Silver, the commissioner, is maybe having issues that are not happening in the NFL, right? So I find that to be an interesting development, that if you're the NFL, you can get around some of these things. Even if you're college football to some extent, you can get around some of these things because there's a level of popularity for American football. But if you're the NBA or MLB or MLS or the NHL, it's maybe a little harder because you're not as popular, you don't have the same sort of goodwill, so it becomes a broader frustration or part of a frustration narrative or frame that these sports leagues are having to navigate, while at the same time, each iteration of these contracts is generally larger than the previous one, so the salary caps are going up, players are making more money, so all of that's beneficial, but then maybe the fan experience is not as improved as the larger amount of money that teams and players are making as a result of some of these contracts.
Yeah. I guess, to piggyback on what Corey was saying there, you have, to some degree, different equations for every sport. So, for instance, if you are a Chicago Cubs baseball fan and you just want access to that content, that's 162 games. Even with the pitch clock, it might be 500 hours of content. That might be plenty for you. If you're a Chicago Bears fan, you got 17 games, 3 hours a game is 51 hours. You're interested in other teams in the NFL in the way that you might not be with Major League Baseball, just because of the sheer amount of content that you have there. Now, couple that with that notion of, if you know what a Pyrrhic victory is, it's a victory won at too great a cost, all right? Some of the contracts that we're seeing signed now, I would argue, are Pyrrhic victories for leagues, in that, yes, you got top dollar, but you didn't get top visibility. And so as a result, is your league going to be positioned well 15 to 20 years from now, when that cohort of fans has a little bit more money to spend? So for, once upon a time, a group of us at Alabama did some consulting with NASCAR, and they had some unique challenges there. At the time, they said, okay, who was our, when we said who's everyone's favorite driver, number one at the time was Richard Petty, who had been retired for like 15 years. Number two was Dale Earnhardt Jr., who was on the cusp of retirement. Number three was Ricky Bobby from Talladega Nights. So you're trying to figure out, how do you build this brand? And they had seen the average age of their consumer had gone up 6 years on average over the last 5, which meant even if you retained everyone you had, it still even got even older from there. Well, you started to look and you see, okay, at some point, they didn't invest in ways to get those younger demographics. They said, okay, we don't need to be on, I think it was CBS at the time. We're gonna take I think they moved to Versus was the channel it was called for a while. And then they came back to Fox and whatever it is, because they realized, okay, just because you can get top dollar doesn't necessarily mean that you have invested well in the future of your sport. And so you have to think to some degree, part of the reason why the NFL is king right now is almost all of their games, even the Super Bowl starts at what, like 5:30 Central Time here? Even if you're in the East Coast, like 6:30, you can watch that. Whereas a lot of the NBA games, for the finals start after 9 o'clock. Some of the playoff games start at 10:30 on the East Coast on a school night for people. You are not investing in the future of those fans. So you've got this confluence of every single streamer needs to have sports rights mixed with, okay, what is better in the long term? And I think lots of times we're forgetting about the long term.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask a series of questions, but it's going to be my last grouping of questions. So remember, when I'm done and they've contributed, I'm turning it over to you. So have your good questions. You have access to some people that know a lot of stuff, right? And then they're going to pick who asked that best question. So I have the easy job, right? I get to ask these really hard questions, and then I just get to sit down. We have a lot of folks out here that are going to enter the workforce and navigate all this stuff, from athletes to media producers to social media content creators. You got a little bit of everybody out there in that audience. Are there particular bits of advice in terms of how do they navigate this? What does it look like? What do they need to focus on? What could they do in their courses to help navigate the future of what streaming does to sports? So I just asked you a bunch of questions. Hopefully one of them lands for you. But I'm really interested, if I were sitting in those seats right now, what do I do next? How can I best prepare myself to navigate the difficulties of streaming and sport intersecting? What do you got?
You go first or no?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, right? On one hand, it can feel really scary and intimidating in general, but especially in this environment where there are so many options, so many platforms for people to potentially create sports-related media. And on one hand, obviously, that's really democratizing and seems like, there are all these opportunities for anybody to do this. And on the other hand, of course, that means there are just so many people doing these things. I think what we see, and obviously past doesn't always predict the future, but the folks that are having success navigating this ecosystem are, really talented with not only video, but the ability to use short form and longer form video to tell interesting stories about sports that create a community, right? I think that is, and this is true across all media in this ecosystem, that, whether you're working on your own to sort of build up, your own independent operation, or you're working within a larger ecosystem with ESPN or related companies, so much of what is happening in this ecosystem is about trying to develop a community of people who will, follow you and are willing to support your work through some of these turbulent times within the broader media and economic environment that we have, whether that means you're able to leverage that into subscribers to a particular channel or a podcast or something to that effect, and translate that into things like, Patreon, or to have sort of Kickstarter support of a new project. But I think, establishing a level of credibility and trust with a community that is maybe even smaller than you're imagining when you start, but folks who are kind of loyal to what you do, I think is extremely important in the ecosystem that we have now, and at least in the next 5 to 10 years. Obviously, that could be completely transformed for a million different reasons, but the folks who I see succeed have that, right? And I think it's easy to say you need to be on TikTok, or you need to be doing Reels, or everything is video. I think that is such a big part of it, but it's more about what you generate and the connection you have with other people, because you have the ability to kind of build that with individuals using these platforms, and maybe you don't necessarily need ESPN support in the same way, or ESPN is going to come calling for you. At Penn State, we had a student who did a lot of content about Penn State athletics while she was there, and other things, and recently this past season got hired by ESPN because of the community that she created, particularly among like female sports fans on TikTok and Instagram. So those companies will come looking for you if you're able to bring your audience to them in these spaces. So I think that's the primary advice that I tend to be giving to students right now.
Yeah, a lot of what he says, I would certainly corroborate. The other thing I would personally assert is that sports is not a field in and of itself. Sports is a context, and so you have to figure out what your "and" is.
Yeah.
What are you passionate about beyond sports? Because if you look, whenever we run surveys and from 0 to 10 rate your overall level of sports fandom, the median response is a 7. All right, so the majority of people are like, oh yeah, I'm a pretty decent sports fan. All right, that's not going to move the needle at all. Former ESPN president George Bodenheimer, when he wrote his book, it was called Every Town's a Sports Town. It was because he was, one of his initial jobs in the 80s is going around to different cities trying to get them to add ESPN to their cable package. And every place they would say, well, you came to the right place because this is a huge sports town. Yeah, it's true everywhere. So what is your "and"? Are you interested in long form storytelling? Yeah. Are you interested in sport and persuasion? And maybe sports promotion or advertising is your jam. Figure out beyond sports. That's a context, and that is great. And you need to know the lingo, and you need to know that Travis Kelce is not only a football player, but is plays tight end and who for, right? That's important. That's not going to move you through this industry. Instead, what's going to move you through the industry is, okay, what is your value added? What's your angle? Are you in front of the camera? Or are you behind it? Are you a writer? Are you a short form content? Are you long form content? What do you truly have a passion for that you could see yourself expanding and growing from? And that doesn't mean you have to lock in at age 22 what you're going to be at age 62, because you need to be able to pivot. But I see a whole lot of people who are like, I just want to be around sports. I just love sports. You at least need to have a pocket of something else that you won't just tolerate, but actually enjoy. And so if you find that passion for, okay, what I'm really interested in is athlete activism. Find that there are really good positions that you can advance within that space. But you've got to narrow your focus beyond just the context of sports.
And you'll be surprised at the reality that there are other people who have that same sort of niche interest or passion, whether they know it already or when they, if you're creating content, right, for the internet or social media, who realize through seeing that type of stuff, like, oh, I'm really passionate about that too. And that's a potential opportunity, again, for you to make those connections or build, sort of an audience if you're an independent creator or media producer. That, having that really hyper-specific niche allows you to find and activate people or find potential jobs that you might not be thinking about if you're just having the broader frame of, I really like sports, or I even really like this particular sport, right?
Perfect. One thing that I will encourage all of you, don't just agree that those are good points. Write that "and" down, whether it's in your brain, on a piece of paper, sport, and what, right? Make sure you've got that as you move through these things. And also, go find these individuals' work. They do some really cool stuff. I know some of you are reading Dr. Billings' book, I think, for 160, right? So now I'm going to field some questions. Panelists, feel free to pass if you get anything that you don't feel that you want to answer, right? So we're going to just dive right in and go through hopefully 4 or 5 questions. And the first hand I saw was this individual right here.
Okay. Since digital media seems to be all the craze these days, what are your opinions on sports media as a written thing, newspapers and articles?
Okay, interesting.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think I have a journalism background, so obviously I'm going to be predisposed to support like the written word. And I mean, I think what What we still see, despite the digital and social ecosystem around all media, right? But so much of what it takes up so much of the airtime on ESPN or on podcasts, right, is still often the result of conventional reporters doing their job, right? Which is often, interviewing sources, making relationships, building those connections to be able to extract information out of those folks, and then still often writing an article that appears on the website, or even just manifests as the form of like a tweet or an Instagram post. But there still is reporting and writing that goes into breaking news that then sets the agenda for 12 hours of Stephen A. Smith on ESPN, right? Or sets the agenda of a week's worth of podcast content, right? Or what folks are saying on TikTok. So not everything, because obviously the game is still there, but still so much of the ecosystem is driven by this conventional work. And if you read or talk to so many of the more new media creators who work in podcasting or work as short form video content creators, they will often still talk about how much prep they do that involves writing and taking notes and outlining. Obviously, some of that is more improv in a podcast or in some of the videos that they're creating. But those folks are putting tons and tons of work into research and writing and developing what they're then going to perform on any type of camera or in front of a microphone. So those skills are still really, really essential if you want to be able to do this as a career. And I think, this is just me, but I think we're going to increasingly see people make, the sort of strategic branding choice to say, all of this was created, by me as a human, not with the assistance of AI. Or if I used AI, here are the specific ways that I did it in my process, as a way to set themselves apart from folks who might not be relying on those sort of written reporting skills, or folks who are using AI heavily to do their research without more of the human element.
Yeah, I still think a lot of our principles hold in this regard. The formats might change, but the desires are still there. In sports media, and especially in journalism, we'll hear the line, if you want to succeed, you have to be first, be best, or be different. And we've had a whole lot of people who focused on different, and for good reason. Only one can be the best. Only one can be first. Everyone else is in the different space. But within that, the desires have not gone away. Maybe that investigative journalism piece no longer is being advanced at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. It's being advanced in podcast form or something like that. But still, the desire for storytelling, for analysis, for expert journalism, all that's still there. In the same way, people will be like, well, people don't go to the movies anymore. I'm like, yeah, but they still like movies.
Yeah.
They still watch them a lot. We still really enjoy a good 2-hour narrative that we're following. We're just doing it differently. So you don't want to lose the forest for the trees there. We're still in love with story. We're still in love with consuming media content. There is a reason why a lot of the tech companies leading the self-driving car space are the Googles and Apples of the world, because they want to find some way to find more hours that you can consume their content. And they're like, if we can take driving hours away, you can consume more of our content. That's all there, but that's format. That's not the key motivation that people have. Yeah.
Thanks for the awesome question. I really appreciate it. Okay, I saw a hand, black sweater right back there. Yep.
I don't really understand why when if you get a local streaming service like Marquee, for example, and then I bought it when I was back home, but when I came back to college, I logged in and it says, oh, there's a location issue, you can't watch it. And same with I think the Bulls channel.
Yeah.
I couldn't watch it at college because it has a local issue, but Peoria is still in Illinois. People in Illinois should still be able to watch Chicago sports even if they're not in Chicago. So I just don't really understand, and I was wondering if you guys have understood what's happening.
It's a lot of it's antiquated and ridiculous. It is. It's a frustration and it's crazy. So I live in Alabama. If we get the NBA package, somehow we are blacked out for Atlanta, which is 3 hours away, Memphis, which is 3 hours away, and New Orleans, which is 4 hours away. The argument is, and the NFL used to have this, like if you couldn't sell out the stadium, you couldn't see the game locally. So the argument is we don't want to, we basically need people for the gate receipts. And truthfully, you need it for the media product to look good. Even if you don't want to be there, it's cooler if the stadium's full. And so you're seeing a lot of weird, like the snake's starting to eat its own tail with how good the media option is. But part of the reason why it's appealing is still because you have the filled arena or stadium or something like that. I think we're going to resolve some of that, but as Don Ohlmeyer once said decades ago, in sports, if any question you have, the answer is almost always money. That's the answer. So once we find a way to get over those, it's going to cost you more to be able to access those locally.
Yeah, and I think part of it is the overlapping, sometimes intersecting different deals that have been signed, right? That a lot of these blackout rules, like obviously predate streaming, they predate cable, right? They go back to the beginning of broadcasting, essentially, as this incentive to get people to come to the physical space. But then when sports leagues, or in some of these cases, like individual teams, have been stacking these different licensing rights for different platforms on top of one another, that has made it more complicated, where in certain cases, if you're in like an immediate geographic area, there is an ability to like watch the game, without a blackout now, right? But if you get further outside of that area, if you're relying on this streaming option, they've put some sort of blackout restriction on it, like you described. I have the same thing, when you, with the NBA League Pass, like then you stack like a league-wide subscription plan on top of that. That gets complicated, right? When I lived here I'm from Indiana, so I'm a Pacer fan, right? When I lived here, couldn't get the Pacers, weirdly couldn't get the Grizzlies, not that I wanted to watch the Grizzlies, couldn't get the Bulls, right? All of those, somehow Peoria is the home team or the home market for all of those. So I think that's another example where it's not the transition to unlimited access, quote unquote, in a streaming environment is not always consumer friendly, right? In that, if you pay for League Pass or Sunday Ticket, all the marketing is focused on all the different games that you get, both in raw terms and just on a weekly basis. But then, of course, there are all of these different exceptions, right, that impact, especially if you're a passionate fan of one team and also still sort of live close to where that team is housed. It actually makes it harder to see the team, right? If you live in a particular state, but not in the city in which the team is played, it's so complicated. And to Andrew's point, like the answer is always just, well, if you pay more for this other thing, you can get half the games here and then half the games there, even if you're only watching one team, right?
Awesome. How many swag items did you all bring?
Quite a bit. So
Quite a bit, okay.
I'm ready to be.
But a lot are very minor.
Yeah,
It's whether
don't over.
It's whether we're handing out the whole bag
Gotcha.
to someone or.
Okay. Well, we got two leading candidates right now. I saw in the pink, I believe. Yeah.
Regarding the tension between consuming sports live or on demand, would you say that clips and highlights on social media have shifted that bar a bit? And would you say that they extend the collective hype around cinema?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it depends, right? But I think certainly that is like the prevailing theory and discourse that we see, especially for certain leagues, right? So for instance, the NBA for 10 or 12 years now has made the argument that yes, our TV ratings, our conventional TV ratings are much lower than they used to be, right? And they are extremely low in contrast to the NFL, right? So the NBA's rebuttal to that has been they were at the forefront of allowing their clips to be on YouTube, their clips to be on social media. They didn't block those sort of things. And so for years, the NBA has said, yeah, people are not watching our games in the conventional way, but we are the young, hip league because so many of our fans are under 25 and they're consuming the league in all of these different ways, to the point of even saying, actually, we know millions of our fans are watching our games illegally, right, on illegal streamers. And so I think depending on the league, there's been an effort to like embrace that. Whereas depending on, at different points, the NFL and MLB have been more resistant to those sort of things. And now they're both pretty in support. Obviously seeing the just pure spread and the amount of clips that are out there. So I think it's a net positive in just the ability to get game footage out there, right? And that people are aware of what's happening. It's harder to, draw a one-to-one point that say this is the cause for why people aren't watching live in the same way. I think there's a dozen overlapping factors to that, but it is something that clearly the leagues are continuing to think about, right? And figuring out how do we package these clips from official channels? What do we allow individual content creators to use, right? There was a lot of conversation in the last couple of weeks. The NCAA has really tight regulation, and their corporate partners, they have tight sort of regulation over clips from March Madness. So like individual team accounts can't even use clips from their games like to post on their Instagram or X accounts in the same way that they can during the regular season, right? And so that becomes something that is, I think, going to be talked about and potentially changed, obviously, as okay, we as this whole unit, the NCAA, or with CBS and their corporate partners, like how do we loosen this so we can get more clips out there during March Madness, because the audience is obviously going to continue to be in those spaces.
Yeah, only things I would add, first of all, yeah, the NBA strategy is an interesting one. Their VP, Ashley Atwell, Alabama grad, Roll Tide. She's smart on a number of levels, but they were really good at figuring out they had different platforms that were relevant at different times. So for instance, pre-game, Instagram, during the game, X, after the game, YouTube. Yep. And so trying to figure out what is your strategy for where's the audience and what platform fits well is really useful. The catch with this is they still don't know how to monetize that content in a way that's commensurate with what you used to get from a TV broadcasting deal. So I'll use the International Olympic Committee as an example. 72%, last time I checked, 72% of how they're funded is from TV rights. Over 50%, just the US contract, because ours is so much larger than everyone else's. They would love to embrace social media, but they're scared to death. If people are consuming the Olympics via social media and not as much through these TV contracts, that money's going to dry up, and we don't know how yet to get remotely that level from the social media content itself. And so a lot of the industry is concerned about kind of the monetization aspects of that beyond there.
And that allows, sorry, I was just gonna say, like, I think the NFL, again, they're able to operate from such a position of power and privilege with these sort of things. Like their experiments for a while, they were a lot more resistant to even putting clips on YouTube. They would block, I remember a decade ago, like sports blogs that would try to embed highlights into posts, right? The clips would get blocked on Twitter, that sort of thing. And I think there's been a recognition over the last 5 to 7 years among, folks at the NFL level that the league is doing so well and is so successful and has navigated a lot of these waters better than any of these other leagues, so that they've loosened the reins in that regard, because to some extent the questions about how do we monetize this are maybe not quite as pressing for them, because in all these other arenas, the contracts that they're pulling in are insane, right? So that they have the ability, like it can just be a space to like show highlights, and we don't immediately have to think about how do we monetize this in the same way as our Fox, CBS, ABC TV contracts, because those are going to be there either way.
So you're saying if we can figure out, individuals in this audience figure out how to monetize it, I think they're going to have a job, right?
Yeah.
I've seen this hand multiple times. Don, right?
Yes, a few questions ago, one of my peers asked about media blackouts depending on the individual's current location. Due to these blackouts, many individuals often lean on pirating websites like Streamies, VIPCs, and Mesh Streams to access these games.
Hold on, can I write those down real quick?
Dana White at UFC calls people who run these websites criminals and has cost the companies billions. Dr. Andy Jones alluded to reasons why blackouts happen is because of money. So blackouts cost the UFC potentially and potentially other sports leagues billions. Why have blackouts and encourage illegal piracy?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't want to say I'm pro-piracy. I guess I would say I'm not anti-piracy, right? From my, like, personally, I have and will absolutely watch illegal streams of sports in the future. And I don't really feel bad about that, given that I support, usually I'm watching something that, like, I either support that league or that team in other ways. So watching one game or a few games or, you know, a random whatever boxing event or WWE event, whatever it is, right? Like, historically, a lot of studies related to privacy as a whole have underlined that, like, the folks who pirate media the most are the heaviest media consumers, folks who are spending a lot of money, whether that they pirate a lot of music, but they also spend a lot of money on music, or they pirate a lot of film and television, but, you know, in a physical media world, they buy a lot of DVDs or they go to the movie theater a lot. So that piracy is just an additional piece of, like, their intense consumption. Sports, obviously, maybe that's a little more complicated because there is maybe a wider gulf between watching something like one UFC event pirated versus having to pay like $75 for that one event, right? Or going to a game, going to the stadium versus watching it in a pirate stream. So maybe that's a little bit more complicated, but I think, again, I go back to this idea of that depending on the league or the institution, I think there are different relationships with those things. I think the leaders of all of these sports leagues know the scale of streaming that's happening illegally, right? And I think their goal is to try to find other ways to get people into the paying part of that equation. But any sense that they're ever going to be able to stop the illegal pirate streaming, I think, is silly, right? So it's a matter of what other strategies can you come up with to convince people that maybe they should pay, right? And kind of develop that relationship. And you can't be as worried about how many people are streaming an individual event. You know, I think the ecosystem in something like, you know, combat sports is maybe a little different because in certain cases there could be fewer events, or those individual events have a price in a way that, like, individual NBA games, you can do this to some extent, but it's not like you have to pay $50 to watch Denver, San Antonio, right? That's part of a larger package that you've paid for that includes all of these things. And I think to some extent, that's why we've seen UFC and WWE in both cases, they've signed with streamers to have where you can get all of their content without having to pay via pay-per-view, right? And I think that's an effort to combat piracy to some extent, but an effort to curb that entirely, I think, will never really work. And from my vantage point, is silly to begin with, but that's just me.
Yeah, a couple correlates there. So it's interesting. We're actually at Alabama having our symposium next week, and I'm doing a one-on-one Q&A with Mark Shapiro, who brokered the UFC deal to Paramount. I've already kind of in pre-prep seen, you know, like, the goal there was to make it mainstream enough that people are like, look, we don't need to illegally pirate that because I already have Paramount because they have so much essential programming. You know, I needed that, so it's already there. So I think that's the goal is, you know, the pain point of one night of UFC at $7,500, whatever it might be, was too great. But if you embed that within something else that people already have, they can work with that. I do think there's even parallels sometimes when you look at what happened with the music industry. Yep. You know, 50 years ago, tours lost money because you toured to sell the album. Now, almost all the money really is coming from touring, and artists are making very little from actual singles sales, or Spotify streams or whatever it is there. They're trying to find a way to make it so frictionless that the Napsters go away because, we don't need to illegally download because Spotify or Pandora or whatever it was is so cheap and so much better that we don't need to go down those pathways. So I feel like sports are starting to move into that space where you say, okay, the media pain point isn't heavy, but as you see with ticket prices, the more media you consume, the more you want to go, and you're spending more than ever on attending sporting events. So it's moved into more, think of the event like the concert there. So we're flipping the model to some degree, and we're in the midst of that here, whereas music has already gone there.
Yeah, and the USC Paramount example is the exact same for why ESPN got in bed with WWE, right? That they were
That was also Shapiro.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Rolling out the new version of ESPN Plus or whatever they're calling it now, right? That WWE provides them all of this content for WWE. It was another way to not only legitimize itself within the broader sports media ecosystem, but be part of this super app, right? That it is now bundled within all of this other content that is, in theory, working for both sides of that equation, that your stuff is more easily available so you can bring new people into it. And for the platform or the content or the, sort of owner of the platform, you now have a whole additional layer or level of stuff that pulls in those audiences, right?
I like it. I've seen this hand come up several times, so I'm going to throw it to you.
So I want to ask, I'm sorry. Say I am an NBA athlete and I am signed or collabing with ESPN. Does the amount of people watching ESPN affect my pay or just take down some of my time? Or how, and if that does, how do I draw more people to watch ESPN instead of Fox or Pandora?
It doesn't directly, it's more indirect. And so, for instance, the NBA, when you're a rookie, you come to, it's either a 2 or 3 day training, retreat, whatever it is, to kind of help you navigate media space. I remember once, they were saying like, okay, Donovan Mitchell, he gets it. They could tell right away there, hopefully he'll be good, which it turned out he was very good. But he gets that space and he helps to navigate that there. So it's building your brand, building your persona, but not, basically from an ESPN perspective, they've come to see, okay, there's some positions that are interchangeable and they don't cost very much. We can move from person A to person B. It's not going to change who watches. They've instead gone to the people who move the needle and the people who don't. I think it's about $350 million that they've now invested in 2 people with Stephen A. Smith and Pat McAfee. Whether that's a good investment or a bad investment, whatever it is, they've decided, okay, those get us the audiences. And what you'll see beneath that would be some things where you're like, you know what, we can swap out person A and get person B for half the price and no one's going to be able to know the difference. So it's about figuring out, okay, how do you actually move the needle in that space, and how do you kind of embed and build your brand from the very beginning to the point that there's something there that's not interchangeable.
And the one place where that could potentially evolve, I think, and we've seen it in the last 10 years in particular, is that, especially at the NBA level, the most high profile players, right? If we think about kind of the older generation specifically, like LeBron, KD, and Steph, all have production companies. They all have their own media company that makes all this other types of media that doesn't involve them whatsoever, things that they're maybe interested in or look good for them from a branding perspective. And then there's also the things that they are in. And I think in both cases, or in all of those cases, they've had some kind of show that has aired on a partner of the NBA, whether that is, a kind of talk show, right? Or in the case of someone like Steph, he's had a couple of like scripted TV shows that he was a supporting character on that was on Peacock, right? NBC is an NBA partner. So it's not maybe that direct incentive, but there's that relationship there where the athletes are thinking about themselves as producers of media or as corporations, and how do they then partner? And I think that could expand as we're thinking about the player-run podcasts, right? Where not a lot of them have signed direct deals with, this podcast for a current player who's still playing is going to actually be distributed by ESPN or simulcast on ESPN2 or whatever. But I think there's a world where that does happen. A lot of those podcasts right now are privately owned or produced, but I think there's a world where they become part of the ecosystem of an ESPN or an NBC Sports in a way that does make that relationship even closer, even if it's not based on ratings for games in a contract, right? But there is a clear financial relationship between ESPN and a currently playing player.
Okay, I got time for one more question, and it can only be 60-second responses from both of you,
Okay.
right? I've seen that hand multiple times. No, Delaney, it's you. Yeah.
So you talked kind of about like exclusivity with different deals in different sports. I think Formula One is a really good example of this. They experienced tremendous growth in the last year, and then this year signed a deal with Apple TV, and that's the only place in the U.S. you can watch their races. So with that in mind, I was just curious if you think this shift to streaming is more likely to bring in new sets of fans or to prevent people from organically gaining interest in sports.
Yeah, I think it's streaming in a couple different ways. So you brought up Formula One. That is a great example of, okay, you had a lot of people who developed an interest, but it was developed through another streaming platform. It was developed through Netflix, was a Drive to Survive. And so you have to think within this space, it's not just, oh, Formula One's on Apple now. It's, oh, there is a pent-up demand for something that has happened. So really, Netflix was an assist to Apple in this regard because people got to know the drivers, they got to know people surrounding it, and then that built the parasocial relationships to the point that Apple could monetize that and use it. So you have to think about where are you in that space, and do you have to cultivate or educate people? I think like the WNBA right now is doing well, but they're still building brands for people outside of Caitlin Clark or Angel Reese to the point that people really know these athletes. That's a different space than, for instance, when Netflix has quarterback or starting five. You're like, okay, yeah, we know Patrick Mahomes with or without the Netflix show. Yeah. So I think lots of times it's, if you're trying to get a new audience, you first have to cultivate people to care about the personalities in it. And that's where streaming's doing a lot of that pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, and to build on that, I think it is obviously really contextual, but I think if you're not one of the major sports leagues, right, there is a lot of, and we were talking about this last night with MLS, right? They also signed an Apple TV deal, and there's a lot of folks within the sort of fan base and within the teams, right, that are frustrated with that in the way that it has limited the number of people who are seeing American soccer games outside of the national teams, right, at a time when Messi has come over here. Other international greats at the end of their career have come over. So I think if you're not in the top few sports leagues in the country, there might be a tendency, to Andrew's point earlier, in let's take the biggest deal that we can get, right? And partnering with Apple seems like such a great idea, but Apple doesn't really appear to have any idea or real interest in like spending that much money in like promoting these leagues or institutions on their own, right? They're willing to kind of go with the things that the leagues or institutions want to do themselves. And so that is kind of dangerous, right? And I think the value allegedly is that maybe you find a different, smaller pocket of audience, that could help grow you in a different direction. But the F1 example is so unique because you took it to a different streamer, right? It made a lot of sense that they left ESPN and would go to streaming given the success of Drive to Survive, but then to go behind a potential paywall for a different streaming service, I think that's a really complicated choice that in 5 years may be one that they don't look so fondly upon.
And I know we're about out of time. I did want to mention too, though, like within this space, time zones are still very real to this. So who is the number 2 market for the NBA? You would think it would be in Europe because there's a lot of basketball interest there. It's in China, and part of that reason is because when the NBA finals are on, they're happening at 3 a.m. in Europe. But they're in a more accessible time zone, actually, in China to be able to follow those. And so when we talk about expansion and, what the Rams and 49ers are going to open their season in Australia, it's a 15-hour flight and all that, you have to think about where's that expansion actually reasonably going to occur? Because you are not going to get people on a consistent basis to wake up or stay up at 2, 3 in the morning to watch these things happen live.
Perfect. 5 quick things. First, thank you for being a great audience and asking great questions. Second, if you asked a question, please come up here so you can get your swag. You deserve it. You asked great questions. The next panel is at 10:30 on an effective sports brand, so we've got about 15 minutes. Number 4, talk to these individuals, folks, throughout the day. If you didn't get your question answered, please do it. And lastly, these individuals deserve this and do not get it enough. If you are able, could you please join me in a standing ovation for these 2 panelists? Please stand up and give them a standing ovation.
Thank you.
I'll see you all at 10:30. Thank you all.